Each week, we are reminded how cruel fantasy football can be when you have superstar players put up duds and guys you've never heard of have the games of their lives, switching the balance of fantasy football seasons forever. And so each week, we go through and look at who were the dumpster darlings in fantasy football, who put up the biggest points for the least amount of teams in fantasy this week. Let's go with our dumpster darlings. At quarterback, only 11% owned. Thank you, garbage time. It was Bo Nix with 21.74 fantasy points. At wide receiver, Gabe Davis, only 17% owned. Remember when he was going to be the difference for Trevor Lawrence? Me neither. He comes in at 19 fantasy points. Demario Douglas, 8% owned, 18.2 fantasy points. Helping things out in New England a little bit. At running back, Sean Tucker, who, if you said you had heard of him going into the season, you're probably lying. 32.7 fantasy points, just muddying up that running back situation in Tampa Bay even more. Ray Davis, 14% owned, a big Monday night, gets him 16.7 fantasy points. At tight end, Hunter Henry, the highest owned of the bunch at 26%. He comes in with 11.6 fantasy points, and our flex is Dameon Pierce, just 6% owned now, 14.2 fantasy points. Our kicker is Matthew Wright, which is probably a made-up name, but he's 9% owned, and he got 13 fantasy points. And the Detroit defense, probably not going to put up some big numbers a whole lot this year, but they did this week, getting 18 points. So this team, where Hunter Henry is the biggest owned player at 26%, he comes in at 165.14 fantasy points. Just absolutely gross and disgusting what can happen with these big players, or with these big games for guys who are barely owned. So that is the fantasy football discussion for the week.